Alright. We good to go? Alright, so this is it. We're reading the final 4 chapters of Five Nights at Freddy's The Silver Eyes. This is the finale of my read-along for this book. And, yeah, we've come a long way. We've dove into some good parts and stuff, and now we're ready to finish it. We're going the distance now, so it's been a long journey, but we're ready to finish it now. So let's see. All right. Let's do this. All right. The last 100 pages. Chapter 10. The screens all lost their pictures and flipped to static. Hey, Marla cried. She banged against the side of a monitor, and the image lurched, distorted, then sputtered, and went out again. She hit it again, and with another spasm of static, the image slowly cleared. As it resolved, the stage reappeared. Something's wrong, Lamar said, and all three leaned forward trying to get a better look. Bonnie, Jason said in a grave tone. Bonnie, Marla echoed, looking at Lamar with alarm. Where's Bonnie? Lamar hit the button on the walkie-talkie. Charlie, he said urgently. Charlie, don't leave the control room. In the control room under the stage, just Charlie and Jessica appeared at the monitors, scanning for signs of life. It's too dark, I can't see anything on these, Jessica complained. There, Charlie said, pointing. Jessica blinked. I can't see anything, she insisted. It's Carlton, right there. I'm going to go get him. Not waiting for a response, Charlie crawled toward the exit. Charlie, wait, John said. But she was already out the door. It slammed shut behind her, and all three of them heard the dull metal thud of the drop lock falling into place. Charlie! John yelled again, but she was already gone. It's bolted shut, John grunted as he pulled on the door. The walkie-talkie sputtered, and Lamar's voice came choppily from the little box. Charlie, don't leave the room. Jessica and John exchanged a glance, and John picked up the radio. Too late, he said, looking to Jessica as he lowered the walkie-talkie. Charlie made her way unsteadily between chairs, but after only moments, she realized that she had gotten herself turned around. The lighting had changed. Now a single blinding blue light was strobing on and off above the stage. Over and over, the floor flashed with a blinking burst like lightning, then was instantly dark again. Charlie covered her eyes, trying to remember what she had bumped into first. Metal chairs and foil party hats pulsed like beacons in the dark. With each burst of light, and Charlie's head began to throb. Hold on, I want to look at something. I want to see if I... Okay. She squinted, trying to orient herself, but beyond the tables surrounding her, all she could see were 1,000 after images burned into her retinas. She had no idea which way to go to find Carlton. She leaned against a nearby chair and pressed her hands tightly over her forehead. A table screeched against the floor briefly, and Charlie knew that it hadn't been her. She turned around, but the light had gone dark. When it flashed again, she was looking directly at the stage, where there should have been 3 sets of eyes. She saw only 2. Freddy and Chica stared down at her, their plastic gazes catching the light, twinkling with the strobe. Their heads seemed to follow her as she moved along the table. Bonnie was gone. Suddenly she felt exposed, all at once noticing just how many places there were in the open room for something to hide, just how visible she was to anything that might be watching. She thought briefly of the little control room she had just left and felt a pang of regret. Coming out here might have been very stupid. Another screech sounded, and she whirled around to see. The table behind her was moving slowly away. She turned to run, but she slammed into something before she could take a step. She jerked up her hands in the darkness to shield herself and touched matted fur. The strobe threw its light out again, and this time, garbled noise blared from the gaping mouth in front of her. Bonnie! Bonnie stood only inches from her, his mouth opening and closing rapidly, and his eyes rolling wildly in his head. Charlie jerked away, then backed up slowly. The rabbit did not try to follow, just continued his bizarre and silent incantation, his eyes aimlessly ricocheting in his head. Her foot caught on the leg of a metal folding chair. She fell back, landing hard on her bottom. She started to crawl, staying low, hurrying to get away from Bonnie. A spotlight flashed from the stage, this one clearly aimed at her. She raised her hand to see who was there, but the light blinded her. All she could make out were two sets of following eyes. Charlie screamed and scrambled to her feet. She took off running, not looking back, and made it across the room and to the hallway that led to Pirate's Cove. She ducked into the bathroom along its wall. The door echoed when it shut behind her. The room was empty, with nothing but 3 sinks and 3 stalls. Only one of the fluorescent lights was on, and just barely, only enough to color the room dark gray instead of black. The metal walls of the stall dividers looked flimsy, and Charlie had a sudden vision of Bonnie, larger than life, grabbing the metal frame with his paws and ripping it up from the ground, the bolts tearing right out of the floor. She banished the thought and ran into the farthest stall from the door, slipping the lock, so small it looked almost delicate, into place. She sat on top of the toilet tank, her feet pulled up onto the seat and her back pressed against the blue tile wall of the bathroom. In the empty room, Charlie could hear her own breath echoing. She forced it to slow and closed her eyes, telling herself to be silent, to hide. Charlie? John was still pounding on the little door of the control room. Charlie, what's going on out there? Jessica sat quietly, still rattled from the screams and crashes outside. She can take care of herself, John said, easing his grip on the door. Yeah, Jessica said. He did not turn around to look at her. We have to get out of here, John said. He rattled the door again. The top swayed a little as he pulled, but the bottom was stuck fast. He hunched down further. There was a lock, a deadbolt that dropped straight into the floor. The latch to pull it open had broken off long ago, leaving only a jagged ledge so thin he could scarcely get his fingers around it. As he yanked it upward, it cut into his fingers, leaving thin red lines. The bolt stayed fast in place. Jessica, you try, he said, turning to look at her. Her eyes were on the wall of televisions. They were all moving static, but every now and then one flashed a picture. Never mind, John said. Keep watching. He bent his head again and went back to the deadbolt. In the bathroom, Charlie was silent. She paid attention to each breath she took, each inhale and exhale, a slow, deliberate process. She had tried meditating once. She had hated it. But now the intense focus of her breathing was calming. I guess I just needed the right motivation, she thought, like staying alive. The stalls raffled briefly, and there was a distant booming sound that went on for several seconds. It's storming outside. She kept her eyes trained on the floor. The light overhead was so dim it scarcely illuminated her stall. She held her breath. The light flickered and let out a brief hum. Then was silent. The toilet tank she sat on felt unstable. She scooted to the edge of it to quietly let her foot down. Just as the tip of her shoe touched the tile, the wide bathroom doors opened with a thunderous bang. Without thinking, she jerked her foot up, and the lid of the porcelain tank clanged like pots clattering together. She held herself perfectly still, her shoe suspended in the air, then carefully pulled her foot back into place on top of the toilet seat. That was too loud, she thought. Carefully, she leaned forward and reached up, with one hand to grasp the stall divider. She pulled herself up to stand slowly, the toilet seat rocking on its hinges beneath her feet. She peered out over the top at the 2 stalls next to her. It was too dark to see beyond the metal stalls, and the whole row of them swayed gently from her weight. There was a shuffling sound. Something wide and heavy was sliding across the floor, not trying nearly as hard as she was to be quiet. Her eyes darted from the stall door beside her to the bathroom door. The shuffling continued, but she could not tell where it was coming from. The sound filled the room. Suddenly, the nebulous sound resolved. It was crisp, and it was nearby. The wall she clung to trembled slightly. She panned her gaze around the room, hoping her eyes would adjust a little more. She could make out a trash can by the door and the outline of the sinks. Apprehensively, she looked back at the door of her stall, letting her focus creep along the edges until she set her eyes on the inch-wide gap along the door. A large plastic eye stared back, unblinking and dry-fixed directly at her. 2 large and unnatural rabbit ears hung over the top at the door. Charlie clasped her hand over her mouth and jumped to the floor as fast as she could, dropping to her stomach and scooting along the floor into the second hall. She heard Bonnie rattle the door of the stall she had just left, but the shuffling feet did not move. She crawled under the next divider and into the stall nearest the entrance. This time, her foot bumped the toilet behind her, and the lip dropped down with a loud clank. Charlie froze. The shuffling thing did not move. For what felt like an age, Charlie held her breath. He must have heard, but Bonnie still made no sound. Charlie held still and listened, waiting for another sound of movement to mask her own. Her breathing seemed louder than before. She lowered her head, trying to make out shapes along the floor. The shuffling sound resumed, and now, without warning, it was directly in front of her. She held her breath, desperately trying to make out any forms in the darkness. There he is! A large padded foot was just outside the door, and if it had stopped mid-step, is he leaving? As if it had stopped mid-step. Is he leaving? Please leave, Charlie pleaded. There was a new sound. Stiff fabric, softly crunching. What is that? The foot outside the door had not moved. The noise grew louder. The sound of fabric and fur twisting and stretching, tearing and popping. What is that? Charlie dug into the floor with her nails, holding down a guttural scream. He's bending over. A large paw touched down gently in front of her. Then another shape. The creature's head. It was massive, filling the space under the floor. Gracefully, Bonnie lowered himself to the floor and turned his head sideways until his eyes met Charlie's. His giant mouth was open wide with a ghoulish excitement, as though he had found someone in a game of hide-and-seek. A warm burst of air rolled in under the stall door. Breath? Charlie clasped her hand over her nose and mouth. The stench was unbearable. Another wave of it hit her face, hotter and more putrid. She closed her eyes on the point of relinquishing the hope of escape. Maybe if she kept her eyes closed long enough, she would wake up. Another gust of hot air hit, and she jerked back, hitting the back of her head on the toilet. She recoiled with pain and threw her arm in front of her, shielding her face against attack. No attack came. She opened one eye. Where is he? Suddenly, the metal walls around her swayed with a resounding bang. Charlie startled and covered her head as Bonnie struck again. The stalls rocked on their legs, and the bolts screeched as they were yanked free from the floor. The whole assembly seeming ready to collapse. Charlie scrambled under the last divider and climbed to her feet, grasping for the door handle to pull it shut as she ran out. She ran back into the main dining area, darting toward the control room, her eyes no longer adjusted to the light. She ran with her hands in front of her, unable to see farther than her next steps. John, she cried, grabbing the doorknob and yanking at it, pushing. Nothing happened. Charlie, it's stuck, John shouted back from inside. As Charlie struggled with the door, she glanced up at the stage. Chica was gone. John, Charlie shouted in desperation. Without waiting for a response, Charlie took off again, running for a hall to her left, trying to get as much distance from the bathroom as possible. The hall was almost completely dark, and as she ran, open doorways yawned at her with wide black mouths. Charlie did not stop to look inside of any of them, instead only praying that nothing jumped out at her. She reached the last door and paused for a brief moment, hoping against hope that it would be unlocked. She grabbed the knob and twisted it. Thankfully, it fell open easily. She slid through the door and then closed it rapidly, trying not to make a sound. She stood watching the door for a long moment, half expecting it to be flung open, and then finally she turned. It was only then that she saw him. Carlton was there. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her, but he did not move, and after her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she understood. He was trapped, wedged somehow into the top of half of one of the animatronic suits, his head poking out from the wide shoulders of the costume. His face was white and exhausted, and Charlie knew why. The spring locks. She heard her father's voice for a moment. It could snap off your nose. Carlton? Charlie said cautiously, as if her voice alone might start off the mechanisms. Yep, he said with the same flattering tone. That costume is going to kill you if you move. Thanks, he wheezed, half attempting a smile. Charlie forced a smile. Well, today is your lucky day. I'm probably the only person who knows how to get you out of that thing alive. Carlton exhaled a long and shaky breath. Lucky me, he said. Charlie knelt at his side, studying the costume for long moments without touching it. These two spring locks at the neck aren't holding anything back, she said at last. He just rigged them to snap and pierce your throat if you try to move. I have to undo those first, and then we have to open the back of the costume and get you out. But you can't move. Carlton, seriously. Yeah, serial killer man explained the not moving thing to me, he said. Charlie nodded and went back to looking at the costume, trying to devise an approach. Do you know who I'm wearing? Carlton asked, almost casually. What? The costume. Do you know what character it was supposed to be? Charlie studied it, and then looked around until she saw the matching head. No, she said. Not everything he built made it to the stage. Her fingers suddenly stopped working. Carlton. Charlie carefully surveyed the array of costumes and parts that lined the walls in various stages of completion. Carlton, she repeated. Is he in there? Here? With a new sense of dread, Carlton struggled to get a look behind him without moving. I don't know, he whispered. I don't think so, but I've been kind of in and out. Okay, stop talking. I'll try to work fast, Charlie said. She had the mechanism figured out, or at least she thought she did. Not too fast, Carlton reminded her. Carefully, slowly, she reached into the costume's neck and took hold of the first spring lock, maneuvering it until her fingers were wedged between the lock and Carlton's neck. Careful with that artery. I've had it since I was a kid, Carlton said. Shh, Charlie whispered. When Carlton spoke, she could feel his neck move. He was not going to set off the locks by talking, she thought, but the feeling of his tendons moving under his hand was unsettling. Okay, he whispered. Sorry, I talk when I'm nervous. He clamped down his jaw and bit his lip together. Charlie reached down farther into the costume's neck and found the trigger. With a stinging snap, the lock sprang against her hand so hard that it numbed her fingers. One down, she thought, as she pulled it harmless out of the neck of the costume. She flexed her fingers until the feeling came back into them, then crawled over to Carlton's other side and began the process again. She looked over her shoulder from time to time, making sure every costume was still in its place against the wall. His skin was warm under her touch, and even though he was not speaking, she could still feel movements, feel the life in him. She could feel his pulse against the back of her wrist as she worked, and she blinked back unexpected tears. She swallowed hard to focus on the task, trying to ignore the fact that she was touching someone who would die if she failed him. She worked open the spring lock again, taking the impact on the palm of her hand and pulling the disabled device free of the costume. Carlton took a deep breath in and she startled. Carlton, don't relax. He stiffened and exhausted slowly, his eyes wide and frightened. Right, he said, still a death trap. Stop talking, Charlie pleaded again. She knew exactly how much danger he was still in, and she could not bear to hear him speak now. She knew exactly how much danger he was still in, and she could not bear to hear him speak now if he was about to die. Okay, she said, almost there. She crawled around behind him where a series of 10 leather and metal fasteners held the back of the costume together. She considered it for a moment. She needed to keep the costume still, exactly as it was, until the last moment. She sat down behind him and bent her knees, positioning herself so that she could hold the costume in place with her legs as she opened it. Hi. I didn't know you cared, Carlton muttered as though attempting to put a joke together, but too tired and too scared to finish it. Charlie didn't answer. One by one, she worked the fasteners free. The leather was stiff, the metal tightly fitted, and each one fought back as she worked, clinging together. When she was halfway up the back of the costume, she felt its weight began to shift. She gripped it tighter with her knees, holding it together. Finally, she undid the last one, and at the nape of his neck, she took a deep breath. This was it. Okay, Carlton, she said, we're almost done. I'm going to open this and throw it forward. When I do, you pull out of it as fast as you can, okay? 1, 2, 3! She yanked the costume open and thrust it away with all her strength, and Carlton jerked back from it, toppling roughly into her. Charlie felt a sharp, quick pain on the back of her hand as she pulled free, but the costume skittered halfway across the room, leaving them clear. A series of snaps sounded, making a noise like fireworks, and they both cried out, leaping back and banging into a heavy metal shelf. Together they watched as the empty costume writhed and twisted across the floor, the animatronic part snapping violently into place. When it came to a stop, Charlie started fixated. The thing was just a torso, just an object. Beside her, Carlton let out a low, pained groan, then turned and vomited onto the floor beside him, heaving and retching like he would be turned inside out. Charlie watched, unsure what to do. She put a hand on his shoulder and kept it there as he finished, wiped his mouth, and sat gasping for breath. "Are you okay?" she said, the words sounding small and ridiculous. Charlie nodded wearily and then winced. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said. "Sorry about the floor. I guess it's your floor, kind of." "You might have a concussion," Charlie said, alarmed, but he shook his head, moving more slowly this time. "No, I don't think so," he said. "My heart hurts like somebody hit it really hard, and I feel sick from being stuck in this room and pondering my death for hours, but I think I'm okay. My mind is okay." "Okay," Charlie said doubtfully. Then something he had said finally registered. "Carlton, you said serial killer man explained for you not to move. You saw who did this to you. You saw who did this to you?" Carlton got to his knees carefully, then stood, bracing himself on a nearby box. He looked at Charlie. "I was trapped in that thing for hours. I'm all tingly." He shook out his foot as if to make the point. "Did you see who it was?" Charlie repeated. "Dave the guard," Carlton said. He sounded almost surprised at that she did not know. Charlie nodded. She had known already. "What did he tell you?" "Not much," Carlton said, but his eyes opened suddenly as if he just remembered something of grave importance. He looked away from Charlie and slowly dropped to his knees. "What is it?" Charlie whispered. "Do you want to hear?" he said. He seemed suddenly calm for someone who had so narrowly escaped death. "What is it?" she demanded. He glanced nervously at her for a moment, then took a deep breath, his face draining to white. "Charlie, the kids, all those years ago." Charlie snapped to attention. "What?" "All of them, Michael and the others. They were taken from the dining room when no one was looking, and they were brought here." Carlton suddenly recoiled and moved toward the doorway, watching the walls as though they were crawling with invisible creatures. Dave, the guard, he brought them here." Carlton rubbed his arms like he was suddenly cold and squinted in pain. "He put them into suits, Charlie," he said, his face twisting in sour disgust. Charlie! He stopped abruptly, a faraway look in his eyes. "They are still here." "They are still here. How do you know that?" Charlie said in such a soft whisper that she was almost inaudible. Carlton motioned toward the far corner of the room. Charlie looked. A yellow Freddy costume was propped against the wall. The costume all fitted together as if he were about to walk on stage for a show. "That's the one. That's the bear I remembered from the other restaurant." Charlie clasped her hand over her mouth. "An other restaurant?" "From the other restaurant." "Oh, come on, not again!" "Alright. Stupid OBS disconnecting and crap. Alright. Michael stared at him. Michael? What do you mean?" she said in a level voice. "I know how it sounds," he said, and then his voice dropped to a whisper. "Charlie, I think Michael's in that suit." "I still can't get this thing out," John sighed in frustration and rubbed his hand. The lock was leaving harsh red imprints on his fingers. Jessica murmured something sympathetic, but she did not take her eyes off the screens. "I can't see anything," she burst out after a moment. The radio squawked, and then Marla's voice came, calling to them from the control room in Pirate's Cove. "Both of you, be quiet and don't move." They froze, hunching down in their places. Jessica looked at John, a question in her eyes, but he shrugged, as at a loss as she was. Something thudded against the door. John jumped away, almost falling. "Marla?" Jessica said, with a pale expression. "Marla, that's you out there, right? That's you out there, right?" The thud came again, more powerful than before, and the door shook under it. "What is that, a sledgehammer?" John whispered hoarsely. The door pounded it in again and again, the dents appearing in the metal door, which had looked so solid, they huddled back against the control room panel with nothing to do but watch. Okay, they huddled back against the control room panel with nothing to do but watch. Jessica grabbed the back of John's shirt, knotting the cloth between her fingers, and he did not shake her away. The door rocked in again, and this time a hinge unfolded slightly, exposing a thin crack between the door and the frame. The door still held, but it would not hold for long. John felt Jessica's fingers tighten on his shirt. He wanted to turn and give her some kind of comfort, but he was mesmerized. Unable to look away, he could almost see out through the little open space, and he craned his neck. Another blow came. The crack widened, and on the other side he saw eyes peering in, calm and expressionless. Get out, Marla shouted, waving her hands at the security monitors, as if John and Jessica could see her. As if it would do any good if they could, Lamar had both hands clapped over his mouth, his eyes wide, and Jason was sitting on the floor, waiting nervously as though an attack on their own door might begin at any moment. The monitors were dark, but it was clear that something large was lurking in the front of the main stage, a black static shape that prowled back and forth, momentarily blocking the entire picture. Marla, Lamar whispered, hoping to quiet her. Marla, look. He pointed to the monitor showing Pirates Cove just outside their door. Marla looked over his shoulder at the other screen. The curtain was pulled back and the space was completely empty. The outer order sign hung perfectly straight across the platform, untouched. The lock, we didn't, Marla said feebly, realizing now the magnitude of their mistake. Marla turned to Jason, then let out a panicked whimper. The door behind him was slowly opening. Shh. Lamar quickly flipped a small switch, killing the light in the control room, and backed against the wall next to the door. Marla and Jason mimicked his motions, flattening themselves against the wall across from him. The monitors still flickered with static, illuminating the space in osculating grays and the occasional flash of white. The small door creaked outward at an excruciating pace, and a gaping black void widened until the door stopped fully open. Marla! A static-laced voice called from somewhere on the floor. Lamar shot out his foot across the narrow carpet, trying to catch the walkie-talkie. Shh, shh. Marla closed her eyes, pleading in her mind for Jessica to stop talking. Marla, where are you? Jessica's voice called again. Lamar managed to flip the walkie-talkie onto its side. With a click, it went silent. He didn't know if he had jolted a battery out of place or somehow managed to flip the switch, but it didn't matter. There was nowhere to hide in the tiny room. The ceiling was too low to stand, and even with their backs against the wall, their legs stretched under the door frame. The ledge under the door was high enough to hide their legs from anything outside, but not from anything that managed to get in. As one, they stopped breathing. The room was no longer empty. Something was entering the space. As it pressed forward into the room, they saw a snout and the scratchy gloss of two unblinking eyes staring straight ahead. The monstrous head threatened to fill the room. Foxy, Jason mouthed, making no sound. The plastic eyes clicked left and right with unnatural motion, searching but not seeing. The jaw twitched as though about to open, but it never did. The dim light from the monitors gave his face a reddish hue, leaving the rest of him shrouded in darkness. His head slowly moved back, his ears moving up and down at random, programmed as an afterthought a decade before. As Foxy backed away, his eyes thrashed back and forth, one partially hidden under a rotting eye patch. Marla held her breath, dreading the moment when the eyes would fix on her. The head was almost out the door when the eyes clicked to the right and found Marla. The head stopped, its jaw frozen, slightly open. The plastic eyes remained on Marla, who sat in terrified silence. After a moment, the head retreated, leaving a black and empty space. Jason darted forward to find the door outside and shut it, and Marla made a weak grab at him, trying to stop him. He brushed past her, then stopped, kneeling in the doorway. He looked into the darkness, only now afraid of what must be there. He crawled slowly forward, his torso disappearing temporarily as he reached outside for the doorknob. Then pulled himself back in and gently closed the door. Marla and Lamar closed their eyes and let out a deep breath at the same time. Jason looked at them. He was almost smiling when in a blur, the door burst open again and an ugly metal hook sank into his legs. He screamed in pain. Marla leaped to grab him, but he was too slow. She watched helplessly as Jason was dragged through the doorway. "Marla!" he cried. Clawing futilely at the floor, and she howled in despair as he was taken from her again, nothing visible of his assailant but the awful glimmer of the hook. Marla dove toward the door after him, falling to her knees and crawling toward the thing, but Lamar grabbed her shoulder and yanked her back, taking hold of the door. Before she could pull it shut, it was ripped from his hands with an inhuman strength. Suddenly Foxy was there before them, coming inside. He was full of life, a different creature, and he turned to look at Marla, his silver eyes appearing to comprehend. His face was a canine rictus, the scrappy orange fur insufficient to cover up his skull. He looked between them, turning his ghoulish smile first on Lamar, then on Marla. His eyes flared and dimmed, and he snapped his jaws with a sound like something breaking. They stared, backed up against the control panel, and then Lamar realized suddenly what he was looking at. "He can't fit all the way in," he whispered. Marla looked. It was true. Foxy's shoulders were jammed in the doorway. His head, the only part he could wedge through the door. Lamar lunged forward and kicked the animatronic, bracing himself against the wall and striking out with his foot 3 times before Foxy gave a low whine, a sound more machine than animal, and slunk back out into the dark. Lamar snapped the door shut behind him and slid the deadbolt into place. They stared at each other for a long moment, breathing hard. "Jason!" Marla screamed. Lamar put his hands around her. She let him hug her, but she did not cry. She just closed her eyes. "What do you mean it's Michael in the suit?" Charlie said, softly, as if she might be talking to someone who had gone mad, while also desperate to hear the answer. Carlton looked at the yellow bear for a long moment, and when he turned back to Charlie, his face was calm. He opened his mouth to speak, and Charlie put a finger to his lips. Something was coming. She could hear footsteps out in the hall, moving toward them. Deliberate, heavy steps, the approach of someone who did not mind if anyone heard. Charlie looked wildly around the room and spotted a pipe in a corner. She grabbed it and hurried to stand behind the door where whoever opened it would not see her. Carlton picked up the torso as though to use it as a weapon somehow. He looked confused, like he was not thinking clearly. "Don't," Charlie warned in a low voice, but she was too late. Something snapped inside the suit. Carlton dropped it and stepped back, a shimmer of blood on his hand. "Are you okay?" Charlie whispered. He nodded, and then the doorknob turned. Dave appeared in the doorway, his head held high and his face grim. It should have been imposing, but he looked just like a man walking through a door. "Now you've done it," he announced to the room in general, then his eyes lit on Carlton unfettered. His face darkened, but before he could move, Charlie raised the pipe high, stepped forward, and swung it down on his head with a sickening thunk. Dave turned, shock on his face. Charlie lifted the pipe, ready to attack again, but the man just stumbled backward against the wall and dropped into a sitting position. "Carlton, come on," Charlie said urgently, but he was looking down on his injured hand. "Carlton, are you hurt?" "No," he said, shaking off his reverie and wiping his hand clean with his black shirt. "Come on," Charlie said firmly, taking his arm. "Come on, we have to get out of here. I don't know how long he'll stay out." "You're awfully calm for just having knocked a guy out cold," she thought wearily. They crept out into the empty hallway, lit only by the dim glow of light from the other rooms. Charlie hustled them through the swinging doors to the kitchen, where the dark was total. The air was thick with a blackness that was almost tangible. It was as if they had been swallowed. She turned to look at Carlton, but only the faint sound of his breathing told her that he was still beside her. Something touched her arm, and she stifled a scream. "It's just me," Carlton hissed. She let out a sigh. "Let's just make sure that we aren't being followed. Then we can find the others and get out of here," she whispered. Charlie glanced back at the door, and the last spots of light peeked under it. She scooted herself a little closer to it, and got to her feet to peer through the round window, careful not to touch it. What do you see? Carlton whispered. Nothing. I think it's safe. Just as she finished speaking, a form passed by, darkening the window. Charlie jumped back, almost falling over Carlton. They stumbled forward, rushing to get away from the door. Suddenly, two beams split the darkness, illuminating the room in a harsh yellow light. Chica loomed there, almost on top of them. She stretched up to her full height, growing taller still. She must have been hiding here all along, Charlie thought. The dark recesses of the kitchen could be hiding anything. Chica looked at both of them in turn, the beams of light shifting dizzyingly as her eyes snapped mechanically from one side to another. Then she paused. Charlie grabbed Carlton's arm. "Run!" she screamed. And they took off, looping around the prep table, the metal furniture clattering as they rushed clumsily past it. Behind them, Chica's steps were long and slow. At last they reached the door, and they burst out into the hall and ran for the main dining room. John and Jessica were silent, listening to the clamor outside. John was resting his hand on the door of the control room. Whatever had been on the other side was gone, or at least was pretending to be. The lock had been wrenched out of the floor. John tried the knob, but the door, twisted out of shape, still stuck. "Are you crazy?" Jessica exclaimed, alarmed. "What else are we going to do?" John said calmly. Jessica didn't answer. John backed up against the control panel and gave the door a calculated kick, moving it an inch closer to the opening. "Here, let me," Jessica said, and before he could reply, she delivered a kick of her own, and the door again moving just a little. They took turns, not speaking, until finally, John kicked, and the top hinge broke. John quickly wrestled the door the rest of the way off until they could crawl out. They hurried out and stopped, exposed in the main dining room. Jessica looked at the main stage in misery. It was empty. "I don't know how this is safer," she said, but John was not listening. "Charlie!" he cried, then covered his mouth with his hand. Too late. Charlie and Carlton were running from the dark hallway at a furious pace. "Come on!" Charlie yelled at them, not slowing down as she passed, and John and Jessica ran after them as Charlie led them out of the dining room into the opposite hall, toward the storeroom they had just come in through. Charlie ran down the hall with a purpose, stopping in front of a closed door and trying to get it open. Behind them loomed the open mouth of a pitch-black party room, a wide, empty space that could have hidden anything. John turned his back to the group, keeping an eye on the abyss. "Is it locked?" Carlton asked, an edge of rising panic in his voice. No, just stuck," Charlie said. She forced it, and the door popped open. They hurried inside, John lingering until the last moment, his eyes still on the darkness behind him. When the door was shut, Charlie reached for the light switch by the door, but John put a hand on her arm. "Don't turn the light on," he said, looking back for a moment. We have enough light. Let your eyes adjust." There was a window high up the door, thick glass with a bubbling, frosted pattern that let a trickle of light and color into the room from the hallway. "Right," Charlie said. A light on in here would have marked them out clearly. In the semi-darkness, she surveyed the room. It had been an office, though not one she remembered visiting often. She was not sure who had used it. There were cartons here and there on the floor, overstuffed to bulging with papers, their lids perched sheepishly on top of the mess inside. There was an old desk in the corner, a grayish-blue metal with visible dents in the surface. Jessica booted herself up to sit on it. "Lock the door," Jessica said in an irritated voice, and Charlie did. There was a button set to the knob, which she knew would be useless, and a flimsy bolt to lock, the kind in bathroom stalls and on picket fences. "I guess that's better than nothing," she said. 10 down, 3 to go. We're on the last 3 chapters now. And we got through that chapter in record time. Only 40 minutes. Hold on. Frames are dropping again. Frames are dropping again. We're still good, right? Yeah, it's getting better now. What? What is that? You not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. So, viewers will experience buffering. Oh, come on! Alright. Stream status still poor. Serious issues that need attention. Looks fine to me now. Oh. Let me double check my stream on my phone. See if anything is going on over there. Alright. Wait, what? Wait. Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What? Wait. What am I looking at? Any day now, Kevin. There we go. Yeah. It's a bit of a delay, but we'll get through it. It's excellent now. Alright, let's continue. Chapter 11. They sat silently for a few minutes in the little office, everyone eyeing the door, waiting. It's just another place to be trapped, Charlie thought. We have to get out of here, Jessica said, softly echoing Charlie's thoughts. Suddenly, Carlton made a small sound of distress. Spasmodically, he grabbed a cardboard box, tipping it over to dump out some of the contents, and vomited into it. His stomach was empty. He retched futilely, his guts clenched and seizing... Grabbed a cardboard box, tipping it over to dump out some of the contents, and vomited into it. His stomach was empty. He retched futilely, his guts clenching and seizing to no effect. At last he sat back, gasping. His face was red and there was tears in his eyes. Carlton, are you okay? John asked, alarmed. Yeah, never better, Carlton said as his breathing returned slowly to normal. You have a concussion, Charlie said. Look at me. She knelt down in front of him and looked at his eyes, trying to remember what the pupils were supposed to look like if someone had a concussion. Carlton waggled his eyebrows. Ow, 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 he groaned his teeth and ducked his head, clutching it as if someone might try to take it away from him. Sorry, he said after a moment, still bent over in pain. I think it was all the running. I'll be okay. But Charlie started to protest, but he cut her off, strengthening with a visible effort. Charlie, it's fine. Can you blame me for being a little out of sorts? What about you? He pointed at her arm, and she looked down confused. There was a small, bright red patch leaking through the bandage on her arm. The wound must have opened while they were fleeing. Oh, Charlie said, suddenly a little nauseated herself. John moved toward her to help, but she waved him away. I'm fine, she said. She moved the arm experimentally. It ached with the same dull pain that had been radiating through it for the last few days, but it did not seem worse, and the spot of blood wasn't growing very fast. There was another rumble of thunder outside, and the walls trembled. We have to get out of here. Not out of this room, out of this building, Jessica exclaimed. Carlton needs a doctor, John added. Jessica's voice rose in pitch, sounding frantic. We're all going to need a doctor if we don't need. I know, Charlie said. She felt a rising irritation at the self-evident statement, and she tried to tamp it down. They were scared. They were trapped, sniping at one another would not help. Okay, she said, you're right. We need to get out. We should try the skylight. I don't think we'll be able to get out that way, John said. There's got to be a ladder in this place somewhere. Charlie replied, her fear receding as she considered the options. She sat up straighter, gathering herself together. It won't help, Jessica said. Air vents, John said hastily. The ones Jason got in through were too small, but there But there have to be others. Windows. Windows. Freddy's had windows, right? They have to lead somewhere. I think it's safe to say that they've all been bricked up. Charlie shook her head and looked at the floor for a moment, and she met John's eyes. This whole place has been sealed. The walkie-talkies crackled to life, and they all jumped. Lamar's voice came over the radio. John? John grabbed the radio. Yeah, I'm here. I'm with Charlie, Jessica, and Carlton. We're in an office. Good, Lamar said. Listen. There was a brief scrabbling noise. Then Marla's voice came through. Good, she said. Listen, I'm looking at the monitors, and it looks like all the robots are on the main stage again. What about Pirates Cove? Charlie put in, leaning over John to talk into the receiver. Is Foxy there too? There was a brief pause. The curtain is closed, Marla said. Marla, is everything okay? Charlie said. Yeah, she answered shortly, and the background static vanished abruptly. She had turned the walkie-talkie off. Something's wrong, Carlton said. Other than the obvious, I mean. He gestured in a vague, circular motion, indicating everything around him. What are you talking about? Jessica was losing her patience. With Marla, I mean, he said. Something's wrong. Call her back. John pressed the call button again. Marla, what's going on? There was no reply for a long minute. Then Lamar replied. We don't know where Jason is. His voice began to break. He's in danger. Charlie felt a jolt through her stomach. No. She heard John take a deep breath. There was a shuddering sound from the other end of the radio. Marla was crying. She started to speak, broke off, and tried again. Foxy, she said, her voice a little loud as she forced the words out. Foxy took him. Foxy? Charlie said carefully. The figure standing in the front hallway, the rain whipping past it, the silver eyes burning in the dark. She took the walkie-talkie from John's hand. He gave it up without protest. Marla, listen, we're going to find him. Do you hear me? Her bravado echoed emptily. Even in her own ears, the walkie-talkie made no sound. Agitated, needing to move, to do something. Charlie turned to the others. I'm going to check out the skylight one more time, she said. Jessica, come with me. You've got the best chance of fitting. Right, Jessica said reluctantly, but she got to her feet. You shouldn't go alone, John said, standing to go with them. Charlie shook her head. Someone has to stay with him, she said, gesturing at Carlton. Hey, I'm a big boy. I can stay by myself, Carlton said, speaking to a shelf. Nobody is staying by themselves, Charlie said firmly. John gave her a brief, precise nod, something just short of a salute, and she returned it. She looked back at Carlton, whose face was drawn tight with pain. Don't let him fall asleep, she told John in a low voice. I know, he whispered. I can hear you, you know, Carlton said, but his voice was flat and fatigued. Come on, Jessica said. Charlie shut the door behind them and heard John slip the lock back into place. Charlie led the way. The closet with the skylight wasn't far, and they crept down the hallway through the doors without incident. The skylight, look, there's no way to climb out through it. Even for me, to get to the roof, I would have to pull all my weight on the glass, and it would break. Even if we had a ladder, this isn't the way out, Jessica said. We could take the skylight window off, Charlie suggested weakly. I guess we could break out all the glass, but that just brings us back to the ladder question. We need to look around. A sudden knock on the door caught John's attention, and he sprang to his feet and listened carefully. Charlie knocked again, briefly regretting that they had not come up with some sort of signal. It's me, she called softly, and the lock slid back. John looked worried. What is it? Charlie said, and he cast his eyes in Carlton's direction. Carlton was huddled on the floor, his knees drawn up tight to his chest, and his arms were wrapped oddly around his head. Charlie knelt down beside him. Carlton, she said, and he made a small whimper. She put a hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into her a little. Charlie, sorry about all this, he whispered. Shh, tell me what's going on, she said. She had a sick feeling of dread. Something was really wrong, and she did not know how much was his injury, and how much was just exhaustion, pain, and terror. You're going to be okay, she said, stroking his back and hoping it was true. After a long moment, he pushed at her, and she drew back, slightly hurt, until she saw him pitch forward over the cardboard box, retching again. She looked up at John. He needs a doctor, he said in a low voice, and she nodded. Carlton sat up again and wiped his face with a sleeve. It's not that bad, I'm just so tired. You can't go to sleep, Charlie said. I know I won't, but I didn't sleep last night. I haven't eaten since yesterday. It just makes everything worse. I had a bad moment, but I'm okay. Charlie looked at him dubiously, but did not agree. Now what? Jessica said. Charlie didn't answer. Right away, even though she knew the question was for her, she was picturing the guard, his eyes rolling back in his head as he collapsed, his thin face going slack as he fell. They needed answers, and he was the only one who had them. Now let's hope I didn't accidentally kill that guard, Charlie said. I don't want... Now let's hope I didn't accidentally kill that guard, Charlie said. I don't want to go back out there, Jessica said. We have to go back to where I found Carlton. Hang on, Charlie, said John, pulling out on the radio again. Hey, Marla, are you there? There was a blip of static and then Marla's voice. Yeah, we're here. We need to get to the supply room. It's off the main dining room past the stage. Can you see the area? There was a pause as Marla searched her screens. I can see most of it. Where are you? I can't see you. We're in an office. It's... John looked at Charlie for help, and she took the radio. Marla, do you see another hall leading from the main room? Sort of the same direction as the closet, but next to it? What? There are too many hallways. Hang on, can you see this? Over the protests of the others, Charlie opened the office door and poked her head out cautiously. When she saw that the space was clear, or at least she was fairly sure it was clear, she stepped out of the open, looked up and waved. There was nothing but a quiet, steady static from the walkie-talkie. Then Marla's voice came through, excited. I see you, Charlie. I can see you. Charlie ducked back into the little room, and Jessica caught the door and shut it behind her, double and triple checking the door. Okay, Marla, Charlie said. Follow the cameras. You can see that you can see that hall. Can you see the main dining room? Yes, she said instantly, most of it. I can see the stage and the area around it, and I can see the second hallway, the one parallel to yours. Can you see the door at the end? Yes, but Charlie, I can't see into the supply room. We'll just have to take our chances with what's in there, Charlie answered. Marla, she said into the receiver, are we clear to get to the dining room? Yes, Marla said after a moment. I think so. Charlie took the lead, and all four of them made their way slowly down the hall. Jessica hung back a little with Carlton, staying so close to him that he almost tripped over his feet. Jessica, I'm fine, he said. I know, she said quietly, but she did not move away, and he did not protest again. When they reached the end of the hallway, they stopped. Marla, Charlie said into the radio. Go ahead. No, stop, she cried, and they froze, pressing their bodies up against the walls as if it might make them invincible. Marla whispered over the walkie-talkie. Her hushed tones distorted her voice even more. Something, stay quiet. She said something else, but it was unintelligible. Charlie craned her neck to see out into the room and what might be lurking there. Some murky form, lumbering heavily in the shadows, poised to attack. There was a long rumble outside, and the panels on the ceiling rattled as if they were about to fall. Marla, I don't see anything, Charlie said into the walkie-talkie. She looked at the stage where all of the animatronics were still in position, staring slightly into the distance. Me neither, John whispered. Sorry, Marla said. Not to overstate the obvious, but it's creepy in here. It feels like it's been midnight for hours. Does anyone know what time it is? Charlie checked her watch, squinting to see the little hand. It's almost 4, she said. AM or PM? Marla said. She didn't sound like she was joking. PM, Lamar's voice came over the radio. Hard to hear, like he was not close enough to the receiver. I told you, Marla, it's daytime. It doesn't feel like daytime, Marla sobbed, shrieking as the building shook with a crash of thunder. I know, he said softly, and the radio clicked off. Charlie looked at the walkie-talkie for a moment, with a sense of emptiness. It was like hanging up the phone, knowing the person on the other end was still there, but feeling a loss anyway. As if they might be gone for good. Charlie, John said, and she looked at him. He cast a nod back at Carlton, who was leaning against the wall, his eyes closed. Jessica was hovering worriedly, not sure what to do. We have to get him out of here, John said. I know, Charlie said. Come on, the guard is our best chance of getting out alive. With one more look at the open space in the front of them, she let them out into the main room. Crossing in front of the stage, she saw John and Jessica glancing upward but refused to look at the animals, as if that would stop them from looking at her. It did not help. She felt their She felt their eyes on her, taking her measure, waiting for their moment. Finally, she could not stand it. She snapped at her head to look around to look as they passed. She saw only the inanimate robots, their eyes fixed on something that no one else could see. They paused again at the hall entrance, waiting for Marla to guide them. After an anxious moment, her voice came over the radio, calm again. Go ahead, the hall is clear. They went. They were almost there, and Charlie felt the tightness in her stomach like a living knot, something snake-like, that was fighting to be free. She thought of Carlton retching on the floor of the office, and she felt for a moment like she might do the same. She stopped a few feet from the door, holding up a hand. I don't know if he's in there, she said in a low voice, and if he is, I don't know if he's awake. Now let's hope I didn't accidentally kill that guard, she had said. She was only kidding, but now the words came back, unsettling her. It had not really occurred to her that he might be dead until the words were out of her mouth, and now, as she stood in the hall about to find out, the idea took hold. As if he knew what she was thinking, John said, Charlie, we have to go in. She nodded. John moved as if to take the lead, but she shook her head. Whatever was in there, it was her doing, her responsibility. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and then turned the knob. He was dead. He was lying on the floor on his back, his eyes closed and his face ashen. She felt herself put a hand over her mouth, but it was as if someone else was moving her body. She felt numb, and knots in her stomach gone, still and dead. John pushed her past. She knelt and slapped the man's face. John, she said, hearing a note of panic in her voice. He looked up at her. He's not dead, he said. He's just out cold. He can't tell us anything like this. We have to tie him up or something, Jessica said. Don't wake him up like this. Yeah, gotta agree with that, Carlton said. His eyes searched the room for devices and tools or costumes, anything that Dave could and probably would use against them, given the opportunity. Charlie just stared, the numb feeling lingering. He's not dead. She shook herself all over like a dog, trying to rid herself of the remnants of shock. And cleared her throat. Let's find something to tie him up with, she said. This place seems to have everything. Jessica headed to the back of the room, where costume pieces were piled haphazardly, empty mascot heads staring out from odd angles with ghastly eyes. Careful touching the costumes, Charlie called toward Jessica. We could always put him in one of them like he did to me, Carlton said. There was an uncharacteristic edge to his voice, something hard and painful. Charlie didn't think it was from his injury. He sat down on a box, his face strained and his arms wrapped around his body, like he was nodding, holding himself together. Suddenly, Carlton's face lit up with alarm. Don't touch, he shouted and pushed Charlie out of the way. He stumbled past Jessica, who was searching through the clutter, and started tearing his way through the mess, picking up boxes and pushing things out of his way, scrambling in a desperate search. Charlie, where is it? He demanded, his gaze roaming around the room futilely. Charlie went to find him, falling where he looked, and realized what was missing. The yellow bear suit that had been slouched in the corner. What? John said, confused. Charlie, where is it? Where is Michael? Carlton sat with a thud on a cardboard on a cardboard box that sagged a little but held his weight. He was only looking at Charlie, as if they were the only people in the room. Michael? John whispered. He looked at Charlie, but he returned his gaze silently. She had no answers to offer him. Michael was there, Carlton pressed his lips, firmly rocking himself back and forth. I believe you, Charlie answered calmly, her voice quiet. John put his hands on her knees and let out a breath. Oh, music. Oh, okay. My bad. Okay. Where was I? Alright. I'm going to go help Jessica, he muttered and stood up with resignation. There has to be rope around here somewhere. Be right there, Charlie smiled at Carlton, hoping to reassure him, then joined the others, heading for the boxes in the corner beside the door. The first just held more paperwork, official forms with tiny print, but underneath was a box of tangled extension cords. "Hey, I found something," Charlie said, but she was cut off by a banshee scream. Charlie was on her feet instantly, ready to run, but everyone else was still. Jessica was pointing to something in the corner, almost shaking. John was behind her, his eyes wide. "What is it?" Charlie demanded. And when they did not answer, she rushed over and looked down at the pile of empty costumes to where Jessica was pointing. It was hard to sort out what in the pile of mascots. She stared blankly at the jumble, seeing nothing but fur and eyes and beaks and paws. Then it resolved before her eyes. A dead man. He looked young, not much older than they were, and he looked familiar. "That's the cop, the one from the other night," John said, recovering his voice. "What?" Carlton said, snapping to attention. He came over to look. "That's Officer Dunn. I know him. Your dad sent him to look for you," Charlie said quietly. What do we do?" Jessica said. She had been itching slowly backward, and now her foot bumped against Dave, and she jumped, stifling another scream. It pulled Charlie's eyes away from Dunn, and looking away was enough to recall her to their task. "There's nothing we can do," she said firmly. "Come on, we don't know how much time we have before he wakes up." John and Jessica followed her across the room, Jessica catching up and keeping close to Charlie as if afraid to get too far away from her again. Charlie grabbed a handful of cords and tossed it to John. It was a long and tedious process. They propped Dave up into a sitting position against the wall, but he kept sliding sideways until John took hold of his shoulders. John bent him forward as Charlie tied his hands behind his back. She finished and looked up to see John with a faint smile on his face. "Do my knots amuse you?" she said as lightly as she could manage. The feel of Dave's flesh, alive yet limp and heavier than it should have been, was disturbing, and as she let go of him, she could still feel the traces of his clammy skin on her palms. He shrugged. "All those times we played cops and robbers seem to have paid off. I forgot about that," she laughed, and he nodded sagely. "And yet, I still bear the scars of the rope burns you gave me," John smiled. And that was before I was even a Girl Scout," Charlie said. "Stop complaining and pick up his feet. Let's hope my skills haven't atrophied." She finished tying up Dave, pretending a confidence she did not really have. The cords were thick and stiff. They were hard to manipulate, and she was not sure how long they would hold. When she was as sure as she could be, she stepped back. John looked around for a moment, as though searching for something, then slipped out through the door without a word. Carlton was on his knees, and he walked toward Dave without standing, and a clunky, unsteady walk. He looked like he might tip over at any minute. "Wakey, wakey, sleepyhead," he whispered. "We've got this, Carlton. Thanks. You just relax." Charlie rolled her eyes toward Jessica, then turned her attention back to Dave, slapping his face lightly, but he remained inert. "Hey, dirtbag, wake up!" She slapped him again. "Here, try this." John reappeared with a can of water. Water fountain was the only explanation he offered. "The can didn't hold much," he added. "That's okay," Charlie said. She took it from him and held it over Dave's head, letting the small streams of water dribbling on from the holes in the tin fall on his face. She aimed for his mouth, and after a few moments, he spluttered, his eyes opening. "Oh, good, you're awake," Charlie said. Then he dumped the rest of the water on his head. He said nothing, but his eyes remained open in a stiff, unnatural stare. "So, Dave," she said, "how about you tell us what's going on?" His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. After a moment, he became still again, so still that Charlie reluctantly pressed her fingers to his neck and checked for a pulse. "Is he alive?" John said, creeped out by what seemed to be an on-again, off-again animated corpse. He moved closer to the man, kneeling so their eyes were level, looked at him gravely, searching for something. "His pulse is normal," Charlie reported. She pulled her hand back, more startled than if he'd been dead. "Charlie, there's something different about him," John said urgently. He reached out and grasped Dave's chin. turning his head back and forth. Dave did not resist. He just kept staring without expression, as if the world around him were not really there. "What do you mean?" Charlie said, though she saw it, too. It was as if the guard, the man they had met, had been stripped away, and what sat before them was nothing but a blank canvas. John shook his head and released the guard's chin, wiping his hand on his pants. He stood and stepped back, putting a distance between them. "I don't know," he said. "There's just something different. Why don't you tell us about the kids?" Carlton was leaning back against the wall, emboldened but still not completely balanced. "The kids you killed. You stuffed them into those suits out there." Carlton motioned toward the stage outside. "Carlton, shut up," John said angrily. Everything you're saying is nonsense." "No, it's true," Charlie whispered. John gave her a searching look, then turned to the others, who had no more answers than Charlie. He looked back at Dave with an expression of renewed disgust. Seeing John's face, Charlie was suddenly struck with the weight of memory. Michael, who had been a cheerful, careless little boy, Michael, who had drawn portraits of them all, passing them around with a solemn pride, Michael, who had been killed, whose final moments must have been all pain and terror, Michael, who had been killed by the man before them. She looked to the others, and on each of their faces she saw the same single thought. This was the man who killed Michael. Without warning, John's arm shot out like lightning and struck Dave across the jaw with a loud crack. Dave slumped back, and John lunged and almost fell from the impact of the strike. John regained his posture and bounced a little on the balls of his feet, alert, waiting for a reaction or a chance to strike again. Dave's body moved upward, straightening, but the movement was too smooth. He seemed to make no effort, use no muscles, and exert no energy. Slowly his posture corrected, unfolding into his slumped state, his mouth hanging open. Carlton stumbled forward. "Take that, jackass!" He swung his arm into the air and swayed on his feet. Jessica leaped forward just in time to catch him in her arms. Dave continued to stare, and it was only after a moment that Charlie considered that he might actually be staring at something. She turned, following his line of sight, then suddenly she recoiled. On the table along the wall sat a rabbit's head. "That's it. That's it? You want that?" Charlie stood and approached the mask. "You need this?" she added in a whisper. She picked it up carefully, the light catching the edges of the spring locks that filled the mascot's head. She picked it up and carried it almost ceremoniously to Dave, who tipped his head down in a barely noticeable fashion. Charlie placed it over his head, not being nearly as cautious as she had been with Carlton. When the mascot's head was fully resting on his shoulders, the large face raised itself until it was almost completely upright. Dave's eyes opened steadily and glassy and without emotion, like the robots on the stage outside. Lines of sweat began to trickle down from under the mask, a stain darkening the collar of his uniform shirt. Uh-oh, I think I know what's going to happen. "My dad trusted you," Charlie said. She was on her knees now, looking intently at the rabbit's face. What did you do to him?" Her voice broke. "I helped him create." The voice came from inside the mask, but it was not Dave, not the pitiful, sour tone they would have recognized. The voice of the rabbit was smooth and rich, almost musical. It was confident, somehow reassuring. A voice that might have convinced you of almost anything. Dave cocked his head to the side, and the mask shifted so that only one of his bulbous eyes could peer through the sockets. "We both wanted to love," he said in those melodious tones. "Your father loved, and now I have loved." "You killed," Carlton said, then burst out with something that sounded like a laugh. He seemed more lucid now, as if anger was focusing on his mind. He shook loose of Jessica's hands on his arms and knelt down on the floor. "You're a sick bastard," Carlton sputtered, "and you've created monsters. The kids you killed are still here. You've imprisoned them." "They are home with me." Dave's voice was coarse, and the large mascot's head slid forward and tilted as he spoke. "Their happiest day." How do we get out? Charlie placed one hand on the mascot's head and pushed it back into position on Dave's shoulders. The fur felt wet and sticky, as though the costume itself were sweating. There isn't a way out anymore. All that's left is family. His round eye reappeared through one of the sockets, glimmering in the light. He locked eyes with Charlie for a moment, struggling to lean in closer. "Oh," he gasped. You're something beautiful, aren't you?" Charlie recoiled as if he had touched her. What's that supposed to mean? She took another step back, fighting a surge of revulsion. "Well then, you're trapped too, and you're not going to be hurting anyone else. John said in response to the veiled threat. "I don't have to," Dave answered. "When it gets dark, they will all awaken. The children's spirits will rise. They will kill you. I'll just walk out in the morning, stepping over your corpses one by one." He looked at each of them in turn, as if relishing the bloody scene. "They'll kill you too," Jessica said. No, I am quite confident that I will survive." "Really?" John said suddenly. "I'm pretty sure they're the spirits of the kids you killed." He all but spat. "Why would they hurt us? It's you they're after." "They don't remember," Dave said. "They've forgotten. The dead do forget. All they know is that you are here, trying to take away their happiest day. You are intruders." He lowered his voice to a hush. "You are grown-ups." They looked at one another. "We're not," Jessica began. You're close enough, especially to a vengeful, confused, and frightened child. None of you will survive the night." "And what makes you think they won't kill you?" John said again, and Dave's eyes took on something shining almost beatific. "Because I am one of them," he said. Ooh, the plot thickens! We're in the final 2 chapters, baby! Final 2 chapters! The last 50 pages. Here we go. There's a bug flying around me. Meh. Stop dropping frames, damn it. They all stood staring... Okay, chapter 12. They all stood staring at the man on the floor. Jessica took an involuntary step backward. Charlie was glued to the spot. She could not look away from him. "Because I am one of them." As if he could tell what she was thinking, John stepped up beside her. "Charlie, he's insane," he said quietly, and it was enough to break her away from that dreadful ecstatic gaze. She turned to John. "We have to get out," she said. He nodded and turned back to the group and gestured to the walkie-talkie in his hand. "I'm going back to the control room," he said. These things are police radios. There has to be a way to get them to reach outside. Maybe I can use the equipment in there to get a signal somehow." "I'll go with you," Charlie said instantly, but he shook his head. "You have to stay with them," he said, barely audible. Charlie looked over at Jessica and Carlton. He was right. Carlton needed someone with him, and Jessica was holding it together, but she couldn't be left alone in charge of the safety of both of them. Charlie nodded. "Be careful," she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he tucked the walkie-talkie into his belt, gave her a wink, and left. Clay Burke was in his office reviewing the week's case files. There was not much. Traffic violations, 2 petty thefts, and 1 confession to the murder of Abraham Lincoln. Clay shuffled through the papers and sighed. Shaking his head, he pulled out the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the file that had been plaguing him all morning. Freddy's. When he closed his eyes, he was there again. The cheerful family restaurant, its floor streaked with blood. After Michael disappeared, he had worked 14-hour days, sometimes sleeping in the station. Every time he came home, he went to look at Carlton, who was usually asleep. He wanted to grab his son and hold him close. He never let him go. It could have been any of the children there that day. I was blind. Dumb luck that the killer had spared his own. At the time, it was the first murder that the department had dealt with. It was a 16-person department, usually charged with small thefts and noise complaints, and to be handed a gruesome murder made all of them feel like a little like kids whose toy guns had suddenly turned real. Clay opened the file, knowing what he would find. It was only a partial report. The rest of it was in a storage room and in the basement. He scanned the familiar words, the bureaucratic language that tried but failed to obscure the point. There had been no justice done. Sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, but it is the price we pay. He had said that to Charlie. He cringed a little low, realizing how that must have sounded to her of all people. He picked up the phone, calling the front desk in a moment of urgency rather than walking the 20 feet to ask in person. Has Dunn reported back from Freddy's? He asked before the officer, on the other hand, could speak. No, sir, she said. He hung up, not waiting for her to finish. Clay stared restlessly at the wall for a long moment, then grabbed his coffee cup and headed to the basement. He didn't have to search the box for evidence from Freddy's disappearances. He had been here before. There was no one around, and so instead of taking it upstairs to his office, Clay sat down on the concrete floor, spreading papers and photographs around him. There were interviews, witness statements, and reports from the on-scene officers, Clay included. He shifted through them aimlessly. He didn't know what he was looking for. There was something new here. There was nothing to find, really. They knew who did it. At first, he had suspected Henry, just like so many others around town. It was a terrible thought, but it was a terrible crime. There was no solution that it would not be shocking. He had not been the one to question Charlie's father, but he had read the transcript. The man had been almost incoherent, so shaken that he could not give straight answers. He sounded as if he were lying, and to most people that was proof enough. But Clay had resisted, had delayed having him arrested, and sure enough, they came to William Afton. Oh, William Afton! Henry's partner. And sure enough, they came to William Afton, Henry's partner. Afton seemed like the normal one in the venture, the businessman. Henry was the artist, and he always seemed to be off in another world. Some part of his mind thinking about his mechanical creatures, even when he was holding a conversation about the weather or the kids' soccer games. There was something off about Henry, something almost shell-shocked. It seemed like a miracle that he could have produced a child as apparently normal as Charlie. Huh? What? Clay remembered when Henry had moved to town and began construction of the new restaurant. Someone had told him that Henry had a kid who had been abducted several years prior, but he didn't know much else. He seemed like a nice enough guy, though he was obviously terribly alone, his grief visible even at a distance. Then Freddy Fazbear's opened and the town came alive. That was also when Charlie appeared. Clay had known Henry even had a daughter until that day. William Afton was the one who made Freddy's a business, as he had the previous restaurant. Afton was a robust and lively as Henry. Was withdrawn and shadowy. He was a hefty man who had the ruddy geniality of a financially shrewd Santa Claus. And he had killed the children. Clay knew it. The whole department knew it. He had been present for each abduction, and he had mysteriously and briefly vanished at the same time, as each child went missing. A search of his house had found a room crammed with boxes of mechanical parts and a musty yellow rabbit suit, as well as stacks of journals full of raving paranoia, passages about Henry that ranged from wild jealousy to near worship. But there had been no evidence. There had been no bodies, so there could be no charge. William Afton had left town, and there was nothing to stop him. They did not even know where he had gone. Clay picked up a picture from the pile. It had been taken, framed from the wall of Henry's office at the restaurant. It was a picture of the two of them together, Henry and William grinning into the camera in front of a newly opened Freddy Fazbear's. He stared at it. He had stared at it before. Henry's eyes did not quite match his smile. His expression looked forced, but then it always did. There was nothing unusual here except that one of the men had turned out to be a killer. Suddenly, Clay felt a shock of recognition, something indistinctive he could not quite catch. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander like a dog off the lead. Go on, find it. There was something about William, something familiar, something recent. Clay's eyes snapped open. He shoved everything back in the evidence box, cramming it in messily, keeping out only the photograph. Clutching it, he took the stairs up 2 at a time, almost running by the time he got to the main floor of the station. He headed straight for a particular filing cabinet, ignoring the greetings of his startled officers. He tore open the drawer, pawing through it until there was employee background checks requested by businesses from the last 6 months. He pulled out the stack and flipped through it, looking for photos in the 3rd folder. He found it. He picked up the picture and held it up next to the one of William and Henry and William, turning it so his body did not block the light. It's him. The background check application was labeled Dave Miller, but it was unmistakably William Afton. Afton had been fat and affable. The man in the picture was sallow and thin, his skin sagging and his expression unpleasant, as if he had forgotten how to smile. He looked like a poor facsimile of himself, or maybe Clay thought he looked like he had dropped his disguise. Clay flipped the page back to see why the check had been requested, and his face drained white. His breathing stopped for a moment. Clay stood, grabbing his jacket in the same motion, then stopped. Slowly he sat, letting the jacket fall from his fingers. He took the partial file back out of his drawer and delicately lifted one of the photos out. It had been taken in the aftermath when the place was no more than a crime scene. He paused for a moment and closed his eyes. Then he looked again at the picture, willing himself to see it as if for the first time. There was a glimmer of light he had never noticed before. One of the animatronics on the stage, the bear, Freddy, was looking toward the cameraman, one of his eyes illuminated with a smear of light. Clay put the picture aside, moving to the next one. This one was from a different angle, but the side of the main stage was still in frame. Chica's body was facing away from the camera, but her face was turned directly toward it. And another smear of light streaked across her left eye. Clay rubbed it with the tip of his finger, making sure it wasn't a defect in the paper. The next photo showed Bonnie in the darkness behind the chairs. A pinpoint of light like a star shone from one of his eyes as though reflecting a spotlight that wasn't there. What is this? Clay could feel his face flush. He realized he hadn't been breathing. He shuffled his hands on the desk like a conjuring, calling forth a picture to reveal itself. One did. The last picture had been taken in Pirate's Cove. Tables had been disturbed, he remembered. The scene was chaotic. The tables and chairs were in disarray, clutter strewn through the halls, but unlike so many other times, he had stared at this picture. He ignored the disorder and focused only on the stage. The curtain was pulled back slightly, a figure barely visible in the recesses behind it, one eye presumably illuminated by the flash of a camera. Clay studied the rest of the pictures, looking for more reflections, but found none. There was no flash! There was no flash! Jason opened his eyes. His leg hurt. It was a steady, dull pain. He flexed it tentatively and found he could move easily. The injury could not be too bad. He was lying on something lumpy, and his whole body felt stiff, like he had been asleep on a pile of... He looked at what he was lying on. A pile of extension cords and wires. He sat up. It was dark, but he could dimly see what was around him. He bent over to examine his leg. His jeans were ripped where Foxy's claw had gouged him, and the gash in his leg was ugly, but it was not bleeding badly. The hook had mostly got a hold of his jeans. Jason felt a little relief. Satisfied, he began to examine his surroundings. He was in a corner, and there was a heavy black curtain strung from one wall to the other. cutting the space off from the room outside. He crawled forward over the cables cautiously, careful to make no sound. He made his way to the edge of the curtain, where there was a tiny sliver of a gap between it and the wall. Jason took a moment to steel himself, then peeked out, conscious of his every movement. He was on the small stage in Pirate's Cove, behind the curtain. He could hear something moving out there, something large, but from his position he could only see an empty room. He pushed his head out a little further, craning his neck to look, but he couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. But with each second he grew bolder, readying himself to leap from the stage and run. A light was pulsating in the main dining room, illuminating the hall for brief seconds at a time. With bright, dizzying carnival colors, it wasn't much, but it gave Jason a direction to run. He watched it intently until it was all he could see. Then it stopped. The room was darker than it had been before. His eyes had adjusted to the light, and now he was nearly blind. The shuffling sound went on, and Jason pulled the curtain open farther. This time he moved too fast, and the curtain was drawn. The metal rings that held it clinked together. The light above Pirate's Cove went on. Foxy was there, right in front of him, his face so close to Jason's that they could almost touch. Jason scrambled back through the curtain, pulling it closed again, trying to escape the small alcove. But there was nowhere to run. He crawled backward, staying against the wall, hoping that the curtain would somehow shield him from Foxy. At once the curtain began to open, not by force, but as if a show were about to begin. Lights and color flashed in silent patterns, and the glittered front curtains rolled back in grand fashion to reveal the stage, with the beast standing patiently at its base. Foxy cocked his head to the side as if considering something, and then he began his approach. He climbed the stairs to the stage one by one, each step a whole series of disjointed movements, as if each piece of his metal body maneuvered itself individually. Jason watched, struck with horror, yet some small part of him was enthralled, it was like nothing he had ever seen. Foxy reached the stage and took 2 more large, deliberate steps until he was standing over Jason. Jason stared at him, too afraid to move, frozen in place like a mouse beneath a diving falcon. Oh, there's the music. Let me, fix that. His breath was shallow. His heart beat so fast his chest hurt. Foxy raised his hook again, and Jason threw himself down on the floor in a ball, protecting his head with his arms, waiting for the blow to come. It did not come. Jason did not move. He waited and waited, wondering if time had slowed down as he approached the moment of his death, his mind trying to give him refuge, making the last moments feel as long as possible, but not this long. He opened his eyes and turned his head a little, keeping his arms in front of his face. Foxy was still there, not moving. Despite himself, Jason met the creature's eyes. It was like looking into the sun. Foxy's burning gaze made Jason's eyes tear up, made him want to look away, but he could not. It was the animatronic who looked away, as Jason watched, peering through the afterburn that clouded his vision. Foxy turned to face his absent audience. His hook fell slowly to his side. His head tilted forward, and he went motionless. The sounds of whirring machinery and clicking parts came to a stop, and the curtains drew closed again. "Ready?" Lamar said. Marla nodded curtly. "I'm ready," he said. She threw open the door, fists clenched, and they climbed out, facing opposite directions, preparing for an assault. Marla was breathing heavily, her face furious. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and she could barely make out what was around her. She could see Lamar, but if they drifted 3 feet apart, they would be lost to each other. The lights above them flickered, but only for a moment. The brief illumination ruined what little night vision they had, making the dark impenetrable. "Anything on your side?" Marla whispered. Lamar looked toward her voice, distressed. "No. Anything on your side?" "Light, please," Marla whispered. Lamar held up the flashlight as though aiming a weapon and turned it on. Above them, the lights sputtered. Jason could see their flashlights waving back and forth, filtering through the slightly transparent curtain. Oh no! The light fell on the animatronic just for a moment, and there was a clicking noise. Jason looked up. Foxy was not moving. The light swept across him again and again. The mechanical sounds came, this time unmistakable. Though he did not move, Jason scooted forward around Foxy's foot and looked up at the animatronic's face as the light struck him again. Again the clicking noise came. Something inside him was readying itself, but his eyes stayed dark. Jason crawled as far forward as he was willing to venture, trying not to cross into Foxy's line of sight. He made it to the edge of the curtain and reached his arm out to wave a warning. "Jason!" He heard his little sister's voice, and then a quick shushing from what must have been Lamar. The flashlight swept up, trained on the stage, and Foxy's eyes lit up. His head swept toward the light and with a predatory precision. And Jason panicked, reached for the pile of cords, and grabbed a cable. Foxy lifted a foot, and Jason threw the cord around it and yanked it with all his strength. Foxy pitched forward and grabbing at the curtain with his hook. It caught, ensnaring him, and he ripped through the cloth with a vicious tearing noise, falling to the ground in a tangled cloth and metal limbs. Jason scrambled past the struggling creature and ran toward the light. Marla reached for him, and he brushed her aside. "Run!" he painted, and the three of them took off down the hall. They turned a corner, and as one, they stopped Jason skidding against Lamar and grabbing him for support. At the end of the dark hall stood another figure, too large to be a person. The top hat was unmistakable. Freddy Fazbear. His eyes were illuminated, their piercing red glow consuming the space around him. They could hear the brittle notes of a song, mechanical and thin like a music box, coming from Freddy's direction. They stared memorized, then Jason found himself and pulled at Marla's arm. "Come on," he hissed. They followed him, running back the way they had come. When they reached Pirate's Cove, they slowed. Foxy had thrown off the curtain and was beginning to right himself. The three exchanged glances, then ran past him. Jason held his breath until they were through to the next doorway, invoking some old superstition. Lamar motioned to one of the party rooms, and they ducked inside. He switched off the flashlight, and they stood still for a moment, their eyes adjusting. The room had 3 long cafeteria-style tables, each one still set for a party. Metal folding chairs were lined up all up and down them, and each place was set with a party hat and a paper plate and a plastic cup. By wordless agreement, they each hid beneath a different table, leaving themselves as much space as possible. They crouched low, hoping to be lost behind the chair legs. And together, they stared silently into the vacant hall and listened. "Hello? Anyone?" John repeated into the radio, but there was only static. He managed to hook the walkie-talkie into the sound system, but getting a signal to the outside seemed impossible. Freddy's was sealed off from the world. He looked at the monitors again. On one screen, he could see 3 figures crouched under tables. Marla, Lamar, and Jason, he thought. They found Jason! He realized with profound relief, letting go of a tension he had not known he felt. Everything on screen was lit with unnatural grays and whites. These must be night vision cameras. He said to no one. Squinting to see through the static, he watched the blurry figures crawl and come to a stop beneath the long party tables. Then movement from another screen caught his eye. There was a figure in the hallway, moving steadily toward the room where they were in. Jason could not tell what it was, but the way it moved wasn't human. It stopped beside a doorway, with a sudden jolt of realization, John looked again at the party room, where his friends were hiding. He grabbed a walkie-talkie and flipped the speaker system on, jamming the volume control as high as it would go. "Lamar," he said calmly, trying to sound commanding. He heard the reverberation of his own voice through the walls of the control room. "Lamar, don't move." John's voice blared over the speaker, blurred with static, but intelligible. "Lamar, don't move." Lamar, Marla, and Jason looked at one another across the distance between the tables. The room lit up with a burning red glow, and they watched as still as they could as Freddy Fazbear entered the room. His movements were mechanical and graceless. And as he walked with deliberate steps to the middle of the room and stopped between two tables, Marla on one side, Jason on the other. Jason looked at his sister and she put a finger to her lips. Jason hadn't realized that there were tears on his cheeks until now. He watched as Freddy surveyed the room. His head, with eyes like spotlights, whirred to one side, stopped with a click, and then turned to the other side. There was a long pause. The two padded feet were motionless, the legs like black trees in a forest. There was a sound of twisting fur and clinking fabric, and the feet began to pivot. Freddy turned around and headed for the door, each step shaking the floor beneath him. As Freddy passed by, Jason shrank back instinctively, his foot hitting one of the metal chairs. It made a scrapping sound. Jason's heart raced. Frantic, he looked across the space at Marla's, who beckoned to him urgently. Freddy had stopped, but they could still hear the sound of fabric and fur scrunching and moving. Freddy began to bend down. His motions were slow, and in those precious few seconds, Jason pushed the two chairs in front of him apart, making a gap just wide enough for him to be able to crawl behind Freddy as soon as he had the chance. The light of Freddy's eyes came into view under the table, illuminating the space beside Jason, and he quickly but quietly crawled between the chairs to where Marla was hiding. Freddy stood again, training his eyes on the floor, just as Jason pulled his foot out of sight. Freddy began to pivot toward the table they were under. Marla put a hand over Jason's arm, steadying him. There was another pause. Lamar, under the table opposite them, beckoned to Marla and Jason, urging them to his own table, farther away from Freddy. Marla shook her head, not wanting to risk making noise. Maybe he's leaving, she told herself. Jason was beginning to breathe normally again when it struck them. Freddy was ducking down again, this time silently. His eyes had gone dark, but as soon as they spotted him, his gaze lit up again, illuminating the room. Marla and Jason scrambled around the metal chairs as fast as they could without touching them. They crawled across the thin carpet between tables until they came across an opening in the chairs and crawled under the table beside Lamar. Marla and Lamar looked at each other at a loss. Freddy was straightened and up again and beginning to circle around the third table. "We have to run for the door," Marla whispered. Lamar nodded and then motioned for them to follow his lead. He watched, waiting until Freddy was bending down once again, and then gestured to the metal table. They caught their breath, trying not to gasp, and Lamar looked toward the door. Could they make it? Marla put a hand on Jason's shoulder, and he started to shrug her off. But she was gripping him tightly, her fingers digging into him. He moved to brush her away, then looked at her. She was terrified, even more than he was. He let her hold on to him while keeping his eye on Freddy, waiting for their next opening. It didn't come. As they waited, poised for flight, Freddy turned away, his deliberate steps taking him to the doorway. The room went dark, and Jason's heart skipped before he understood what had happened. The lights were gone because Freddy was gone. "Marla," he whispered, his voice little more than a breath of air. "He's gone." Marla looked at him and nodded, but he did not let go of his shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked in the same almost soundless way. He nodded, then pointed to his legs and shrugged theatrically. She smiled at him and took her hand from his shoulder to muss his hair. Suddenly, Lamar was tapping Marla's arm. He pointed to his ear, and she gave him a puzzled look. Jason stiffened, realizing what it was, and in a second Marla did too. There was music in the room, a tinny, labored sound like a music box, the gapes between the notes just a little too long. The room lit up again, a drowning red, and before they could move, the table was wrenched away. Freddy stood over them. He shoved the table aside, almost hurling it. They screamed, not a scream for help, but the last futile act of defiance. Jason clung to his sister and she pulled his head down against her, shielding his eyes so he would not have to see. Suddenly, Freddy stumbled off balance and lurched to the side. He tried to right himself, but another jolt from behind sent him flying toward, falling face first into the tables. Marla, Lamar, and Jason looked up to see Charlie and John, their faces flushed with effort. "Come on," Charlie said. "Let's go." Dave shrugged out of his bonds quickly. The knots were sturdy, but the cords had too much give a few twists and turns, and he was set free. And he was free. He crawled to the door on hands and knees and held his ear to the crack, careful not to jostle the door and give himself away. The loudspeaker blared, and then the sound he had been waiting for. Footsteps running away. He waited just until the sound faded, then got purposefully to his feet. "Where are we going?" Marla panted, as they raced back toward the main dining room. "The office," Charlie said. "It's got a real door. We can barricade ourselves in." She glanced at John, who nodded shortly. What they would do once they were barricaded inside was another question, but they could not worry about that once they were safe. They ran through the dining room. Charlie glanced at the stage, blurred in passing, but when she saw what she knew she would, it was empty. It was empty. They reached the narrow hall that led to the office, and Charlie's heart lifted when she saw the door light shining from its small window like a beacon. "What? Light?" She slowed her pace. They were 10 feet from the door. She lifted a hand, signaling the others to stop, and they approached. The door slowly stealing the door approaching the doors. Let me see. As they approached the door slowly, steeling herself, Charlie grabbed the knob and turned. It was locked. She looked helplessly at the others. "Someone's in here." "Someone's in there," Jason whispered, moving closer to Marla. "There's no one else here," Marla said softly, but it sounded like a question. Charlie was about to try the door again, but stopped herself. "Don't draw their attention." "He got loose," Jessica said, her voice hoarse, and Charlie felt a chill. She's right. She didn't say it. We have to go back." "We have to go back," she said. Without waiting for a response, she turned, pushing between Lamar and John to take the lead. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped dead as she heard the others gasp. It was Chica, her eyes like burning orange headlights. She stood at the other end of the short hall, blocking their only way out. Her body filled the space. They could not even try to run past her. Charlie glanced behind her, even though she knew there was no other way out. Before she could react, John was running at the animatronic. He had no weapons, but he hurled himself toward the thing and leapt up, trying to grab hold of her neck. He caught it briefly, struggling to hold on as Chica thrashed her head back and forth. Chica bent forward and swung to the side, slamming John into the wall, and John let go, crumpling to the floor. The cupcake on Chica's platter snapped its mouth as if laughing, its eyes rolling in their tiny sockets. "John!" Charlie cried as she thrust the flashlight back for someone else to take. She felt its weight leave her hands, but she didn't look back to see who took it. She looked up. There was an electrical cord dangling above their heads. Parts of the rubber had worn away, exposing stretches of bare wire. Chica was slowly advancing. Charlie jumped up, but she could not get high enough to reach it. She looked to either side. Is it narrow enough? She glanced at Chica. She was moving slowly, with measured steps. They were trapped, and she did not need to hurry. Charlie planted one foot against the wall, then stretched her leg across the narrow hallway, and did the same on the other side, bracing between the walls to climb. She inched upward, her legs shaking with the effort. She looked up, struggling to retain her balance as she reached for the cord. Careful to touch only the rubber, she closed her fingers around it and dropped to the ground. Chica lunged forward, her arms extended and her teeth contorted in a mechanical smile. Charlie sprang up. The electrical cord brandished in front of her, and she shoved it into the space between Chica's head and her torso. Chica jerked backwards, sparks flying, and for a horrible moment, Charlie could not move. Her hand throbbed with the electrical current, and she was caught in there, unable to make her hand let go of the wire. She stared down at it, willing her fingers to open. Is this how I die? Lamar grabbed her and pulled her away, and she looked up at him, wide-eyed. The others were already running. Chica was deactivated, or so it appeared. Slumped forward, her eyes dark. Lamar gave her arm a tug, and they took off after the others. With a pleased smile, Dave watched the confrontation through the window in the office door. Just a matter of time now, he thought. The girl had been clever climbing the walls like that, but she had almost killed herself. They could not last much longer. All he had to do was wait. Suddenly, the room was lit with an ethereal blue. He froze, then slowly turned. Bonnie, the animatronic, towered over him, close enough to touch. Dave fell back against the door and screamed. There was a scream from the direction of the office. The group paused for a minute and looked nervously at one another. It doesn't matter, Charlie said. Come on. She took a quiet look back at Chica, who was still slumped forward inert. Charlie led them into the main dining room. As they emerged, there was a sudden movement. Foxy was there. He leaped onto a table in front of them, looking among them until his silver eyes lit on Jason. He crouched as if he were about to jump. On the boy, and Charlie grabbed a napkin dispenser and threw it as hard as she could. It struck Foxy's head, glancing off with little effect, but it was enough to get his attention. He turned to her and pounced. Charlie was already running, racing to lure him away from the others. Then what? She thought, as she ran furiously out of the dining room, down the hall. The arcade! It was dark. There were still things to hide behind. She kept running full out until she reached the door, then turned so fast she almost fell, hoping to give Foxy a moment's disorientation. She looked around frantically. There was a row of arcade machines at the back of the room, set out just a little from the wall. She heard footsteps behind her and dove for it. And now, let me see. Okay. Okay then! The space was so tight, she could barely squeeze herself into it. Her sides were pressed between the consoles and the wall, and there were thick, coiled wires beneath her feet. She took a step back, moving deeper into the crawl space, but her foot slipped on a cable, and she barely kept from falling. Movement in the room caught her eye, and she saw a flash of silver light. And now, we're quoting Chapter 1. We're in Chapter 12, quoting Chapter 1. He sees me. Charlie dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled backward, scooting inch by inch. Her foot caught on a cable, and she stopped to free it, twisting into an impossible position to quietly dislodge it. She moved back further, and then her foot bumped against another wall, and she stopped. She was closed in on three sides. It almost felt safe. She closed her eyes for a moment. Nothing here is safe. There was an awful sound, a clash of metal hitting metal, and the console at the far end of the row rocked on its foundation, banging back against the wall. Foxy leaned over it, and now Charlie could see him as he smashed his display, spilling shards of plastic onto the floor. His hook caught on something inside the machine, and he yanked it out again, trailing bits of wire. He moved on to the next game, smashing the screen and throwing the console against the wall with a casual brutality. Charlie felt the impact of it echoing through the wall as he moved closer. I have to get out. I have to. But there was no way out. Now that she was sitting in one piece, she realized that her arm was stiff with pain, and only now did she look at it. The bandage was soaked through with blood. The wall beside her was streaked with a line of it, and where her arm had pressed. She wanted to cry suddenly. Her whole body ached. The wound in her arm, the constant tension of the last day or so, who could tell how long it had been, was draining her, taking all she had. The next console crashed against the wall, and Charlie flinched. It was only 2 away. He was almost to her. She could hear his gears working, humming and grinding, and sometimes screeching. She closed her eyes, but she could still see him. His matted fur, the metal bones showing through, the searing silver eyes. The console beside her was wrenched away and tumbled to the ground like it weighed nothing at all. The cords beneath Charlie's hand and knees jerked forward with it, and she slipped, grabbing at nothing, trying to regain her balance. She caught herself and looked up just in time to see the downward swing of a hook. That's where Chapter 1 began, and now the rest of Chapter 12. She moved faster than she could think. She hurled herself at the final console with all her strength, and it balanced precariously, then fell, knocking Foxy to the ground and trapping him. Charlie started to run, but his hook shot out and snared her leg, cutting into her. She screamed, falling to the ground. She kicked at him and with her other foot, but his hook was stuck deep in her leg. Every time he jerked back, she felt the impact. She kicked him in the face and his hook tore free, slicing open her leg. She screamed again, indistinctively, grabbing the wound, and then Foxy was on top of her, snapping his jaws and clawing her as he tried to free his legs from under the console. She fought back, struggling to get away. His hook slashed at her again and again as she tried to block the blows, screaming for help. Suddenly, John was there. He stood over Foxy and stomped down hard on the creature's neck, holding his foot there. Foxy flailed but could not reach him. "Charlie, get up," he called. Charlie just stared at him for a second, too shaken to register the question. He stamped his foot on Foxy's neck repeatedly, and then in one quick movement, he grabbed Charlie's hand, heaved her up, and started to run, pulling her along behind him. They made it to the main dining room, where the rest of the group was huddled in the middle of the room. Relieved, Charlie rushed to join them. She could tell she was limping, but she did not feel any pain, which she realized somewhere dimly in the back of her mind was not good. When they got to the others, her heart sank. Their faces were grim. Lamar was holding the flashlight out in front of him, but it rattled in his trembling grip. Marla gestured quickly to the entrances. Freddy stood in the hall to the storage room, while Bonnie now blocked the hallway to the office. Chica, reanimated, stood on the stage, looming over them. Charlie glanced back the way they had come. Foxy was approaching. He had freed himself. He stopped in the doorway as if waiting for a signal. There was no escape. Suddenly, acutely aware of everything around her, Charlie noticed the sound of a music box, as if she had, unconsciously, been hearing it all along. She took a deep breath. The moment seemed to go on forever. It had come to this. They were trapped. They waited. Now perhaps for the animatronics, there was no hurry. Charlie cast her eyes around futilely for a weapon, but there were only party hats and paper plates. As one, the animatronics started their approach. Charlie grabbed the back of a metal folding chair, not sure how she could even use it. The animals were moving faster now, coming in unison, as if this battle were a choreographed dance. Marla took Jason's hand and whispered something in his ear. Whatever it was, he shook his head, set his jaw, and balled his hands into fists. Lamar glanced at him for a moment but said nothing. Jessica had her hands stiffly at her side, and she was murmuring something to herself inaudibly. The animals were almost on top of them. Freddy's trundling walk was predatory, and the music box notes were coming from Freddy's direction, from inside Freddy. She now realized. Chica leaped from the stage and took small bouncing steps toward them, as if excited but holding herself back. Bonnie's big paw-like feet slapped on the ground like a challenge, and Foxy slunk forth with a malevolent grace, his eyes fixed on Charlie, as if she were the only thing he saw. She gazed into his silver eyes. They filled her vision, crowding out everything else until the world was silver. The world was Foxy's eyes, and there was nothing left of her. John squeezed her hand. It broke the spell. She looked at him, her vision still cloudy. "Charlie," he said haltingly. "Charlotte." "Shh," she said. "Later." He nodded, accepting the lie that there would be a later. Foxy crouched down again, and Charlie let go of John, her heart pounding as she braced for it. Foxy's joints shifted in their sockets as he prepared to spring. Then he stopped. Charlie waited. There was no screams from behind her, no sounds of fighting. Even the music box was silent. Foxy was motionless, though his eyes still glowed. Charlie looked around, and then she saw it was Freddy. Not the one they all knew, not the one who stood less than a foot away from Marla. His mouth opened as if poised to bite. It was the other one, the one she remembered, the yellow Freddy from the diner, the costume her father used to wear. It was looking at them, staring from the corner, and now she heard something. It was indistinct, just whispers in her head, a gentle susurrus blowing through her conscious mind without taking hold. She looked at the others and knew they heard it too. It was indecipherable, but the meaning was unmistakable. Carlton was the one who said it. "Michael?" The sounds they heard grew a warm, unspoken confirmation, and together they approached the Golden Bear. Marla and brushed past Brown Freddy as if he were not there, and Charlie turned her back to Foxy, unafraid. There was only one thought in her mind. "Michael, it's you!" They were almost to him. All Charlie wanted to do was fling his arms around him, hold him close, and to be again the little girl she was so long ago, to embrace him again. This beloved child who had been ripped from her lives on that carefree afternoon. To do it all over, and this time to rescue him, this time to save his life. "Michael," she whispered. The yellow bear stood motionless. Unlike the others, there seemed to be nothing inside of it. It stood of its own accord, by its own will. There was nothing to hold the costumed jaw closed. Its eyes were empty. Suddenly aware that their backs were to the other animatronics, Charlie startled and turned up apprehensive. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy stood at rest, almost as if they were back on their stages. Their eyes were locked on Charlie, but they had halted their approach. "It's the kids, Carlton whispered. "Foxy wasn't attacking Jason," Marla gasped. "Foxy was trying to protect him." John took hesitant steps toward the middle of the dining room, then approached more boldly, looking at each of the robots in turn. "It's the kids," he echoed. "All of them." Their faces were no longer animalistic, no longer lifeless, as if some spirit inhabited them. Suddenly, there was a crash from the sealed exit door. They all startled, turning as one as the wall beside the wielded entrance shook with the force of a dozen blows. Now what? Charlie thought. The bricks broke and fell, scattering in pieces across the floor, dust filling the air in rusty clouds. A figure stepped through the hole, wielding a massive sledgehammer, and as the air slowly cleared, they saw who it was. Clay Burke, Carlton's father! See, I knew this would happen. His eyes set on Carlton, and he dropped the hammer and ran to his son, sweeping him into an embrace. Clay stroked his hair and gripping him like he would never let go. Charlie watched from her distance, relief touched by a stiletto edge of envy. "Dad, I'm going to puke," Carlton muttered. Clay laughed, but leaned back when he saw that Carlton wasn't kidding. Carlton bent over, hands on his knees, fighting the urge to retch, and Clay's face took on alarm. Carlton straightened. "I'm good." Clay was not listening anymore. He was looking around the room at the animals. All of them were frozen in time, displaced. "Okay, kids," Clay said, his voice low and his words careful. "I think it's time for us to go." He started toward the exit he had made. They glanced at another. The whispers were gone. Whatever he had Whatever he had been, the yellow Freddy was slouched again, an empty suit, though no one had seen it move. Charlie nodded toward Clay, and the rest started forward, heading almost reluctantly to the hole in the wall. Charlie hung back. John stayed beside her, but she gestured him forward, taking up the rear. She had barely had time to take a step when something took hold of her throat. Charlie tried to cry out, but her windpipe was being crushed. She was whipped around as if she weighed nothing, and she found herself face to face with the yellow rabbit. Dave's eyes were shining through triumphant. He had his arm around her neck, squeezing her throat so tightly that she could scarcely breathe. He held her so close it was almost an embrace. She could smell the costume, stained fur, and years of putrid sweat, blood, and cruelty. She spoke, still staring at Charlie. "You are staying." "Absolutely not," Clay said, taking on the group's authority. Dave dug his fingers deeper into Charlie's neck, and he made a strangled sound. "I will kill this one right here while you watch, unless you do as I say," he said, and his voice was almost pleasant. Clay looked at him for a long moment, calculating, then nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice calm. "We'll do as you say. What do you want?" "Good," Dave said. He relaxed his grip on Charlie's neck, and she took a shaky breath. Clay began to move toward them, and the others followed. Charlie looked up at the man in the rabbit suit, and he met her gaze. "It was you. You killed Michael. You killed Sammy. You took them from me." His eyes should have held something fierce and dangerous. They should have been windows to the rotten core inside, but they were only eyes, flat and empty. Charlie plunged her hands into the gap beneath the costume's head. Dave drew back, and she held on. "If you want to be one of them, then be one of them," she shouted, and she tripped the spring locks. Dave's eyes widened, and then he screamed. Charlie jerked her hands free, barely evading the locks as they snapped open and plunged into his neck. She took a step back, watching as Dave crumpled to the ground, still screaming as the costume released. Part by part, the animatronic parts inside pierced his flesh, ripping up his organs, tearing through his body as if it were not even there. At some point, he stopped screaming, but he still writhed on the floor for what felt like long minutes before he was still. Charlie stared, breathing hard as if she had been running. The form on the ground seemed unreal. John was the first to move. He came up beside her, but still staring down. She waved him off before he could touch her. She could not bear it as if he did. Jessica gasped as they all looked up. The animatronics were moving. The group drew back, huddling together, but none of the animals were looking at them. One by one, they took a hold of the broken body on the floor and began to drag it away toward the hall to Pirate's Cove. As they disappeared down the hallway, Charlie noticed the yellow Freddy was gone. "Let's go," she said quietly. Clay Burke nodded, and they filed out of the restaurant for the last time. All right, let's see. The last 10 pages, chapter 13. We're at the very end. We're at the end game now. Chapter 13. The sun was rising as they emerged into the open air. Clay put his arms around Carlton's shoulder, and for once, Carlton didn't brush him away with a joke. Charlie nodded absently, blinking in the light. "Carlton and I are taking a drive to the ER, Clay continued. "Is there anyone else who needs a doctor?" "I'm fine," Charlie said reflexively. "Jason, do you need to go to the hospital?" Marla asked. "No," he said. Let's see your leg," she insisted. The party stopped as... "Let's see your leg," she insisted. The party stopped as Jason held his leg out for Clay to examine. Charlie felt an odd relief wash through her. A grown-up was in charge now. For a moment, Clay looked up at Jason with a serious face. I don't think we're going to have I don't think we're going to have to cut it off, he said. Not just yet, Jason smiled. He said, not just yet. Jason smiled, and Clay turned to Marla. I'll take care of him. It might leave a scar, but that'll just make him look tough. Marla nodded and winked at Jason, who laughed. I need to change my clothes, Charlie said. It seemed like a petty thing to be worrying about, but her shirt and pants were wet with blood in some places, dry and stiff in others. It was beginning to itch. You're a mess, Carlton pointed out, redundantly. Will she get a ticket if she drives like that? Charlie, are you sure you don't need to go to the hospital? Marla said, turning her laser-like concern on her friend now that her brother had been declared safe. I'm fine, Charlie said again. I just need to change my clothes. We'll stop at the motel. When they reached the cars, they split into what had become their habitual groups. Marla, Jason, and Lamar in Marla's car, Charlie, John, and Jessica in Charlie's. Charlie opened the door to the driver's side and stopped, looking back at the building. It wasn't just her out of the corner of her eye. She could see them all gazing at it. The empty mall was dark against the pink-streaked sky, long and squat, like something brutish and slumbering. They all turned away, getting into the cars without speaking. Charlie kept her eyes on it, watching as she started her car, waiting to turn her back to it until the last possible moment. She pulled out of the lot and drove away. Along the road, the cars split off. Clay and Carlton took the other turn out of the parking lot, heading to the hospital, and Charlie turned off toward the motel while Marla continued to the Burke's house. I call for shower, Jessica said as they got out of the car. Then, seeing Charlie's face, I'll make a special exception in your case. You go first. Charlie nodded. In the room, she grabbed her bag and took it into the bathroom with her, leaving John and Jessica to wait. She locked the door behind her and undressed deliberately, not looking at the gashes on her arm and leg. She didn't need to see what was there, just to clean and bandage it. She got into the shower and let out a quiet yelp as the stinging water hit her open cuts, but she gritted her teeth and cleaned herself, washing her hair over and over until it was rinsed clean. She got out and toweled herself dry, then sat down on the edge of the tub. She put her face in her hands and closed her eyes. She was not ready to go out yet, not ready to face whatever aftermath, whatever discussion there might have to be. She wanted to walk out of this bathroom and never speak again of what had happened. She rubbed her temples. She didn't have a headlace, but there was a pressure inside there, something that had yet to emerge. You can't stay here forever. Charlie still had the gauze and tape from the first time around, and so she took it from her bag and wiped both wounds clean with a hotel towel and bound up her arm and leg using all the gauze. I probably need stitches, she thought, but it was only an idle thought. She would not do it. She got up and went to look in the mirror. There was a cut across her cheek. It had stopped bleeding, but it was ugly. She didn't know how to cover it, but she didn't really want to. For the same reason she didn't want the stitches. She didn't want stitches. She wanted them to heal wrong. She wanted them to scar. She wanted proof displayed on her body. This happened. This was real. This is what it did to me. She dressed quickly in her jeans and her last remaining clean t-shirt and emerged from the bathroom to find Jessica and John carrying suitcases out to the car. I figured there was no point of leaving stuff here, Jessica said. We're all going in the morning. We may as well bring it all to Carlton's. Charlie nodded and grabbed Jason's backpack, taking it out to the car along with her own. Alright. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 more pages left and we're done. Carlton and his father were already back by the time they arrived, and again they entered Carlton's living room, now almost familiar. Carlton was curled up in an armchair by the fireplace. where someone had lit a fire, and Marla and Lamar were on the couch. Jason sat up right in front of the fireplace, staring in at the licking flames. Charlie sat down near him, arranging herself stiffly. John joined her, looking at her with concern, but she ignored him and he said nothing. "Are you okay?" Charlie asked, reaching up and rubbing Carlton's arm for a moment. He looked at her sleepily. "Yeah, it's a mild concussion," he said. "I'll be fine as long as no one else tries to murder me." "So, now what?" Jessica asked, as she took to the chair beside Carlton. She paused, searching for words. "What happens?" she said finally. They looked at each other. It was the question they all had. What do you do after something like this? Charlie looked at Clay, who was standing in the doorway, only half in the room. "Mr. Clay, what happens now?" she said quietly. He looked off into the distance for a moment before She looked off into the distance for a minute before answering. "Well, Charlie, I'm going to go back to Freddy's. I have to get my officer," he said gravely. "I won't go alone." He forced a smile, but no one joined him. "What do you think should happen?" he asked. He was looking at Charlie, asking her this impossible question as if she could answer it. She nodded, accepting responsibility. "Nothing," she said. "It's over. I want to leave it that way." Clay gave her a nod, his face impassive. She could not tell if it was the answer he was looking for, but it was all she had. The others were silent. Marla and Lamar were nodding, but Jessica looked like she wanted to protest. "Jessica, what?" Charlie said gently, realizing with unease that her friend wanted her permission to disagree. "It just seems wrong," she said. "What about everything? People should know, right? That's how it works. That guard, he murdered all those kids, and people should know." "No one will believe us," Jason said, without looking up. "Officer Dunn," Jessica said. "Officer Dunn. He died in there. What will you tell his family? Will you tell them the truth?" She looked at Clay. Officer Dunn died at the hands of the same man who killed your friends. I could prove that now." A silence fell over the room. "It won't bring them back," Clay said softly, "but maybe it will give them some rest." Clay turned his eyes to the fire, and a few minutes passed before he spoke again. "You kids have been carrying Freddy's with you all these years. It's time you left it behind," he said. He was stern, but his commanding tone was reassuring. "I'm going to see to it that Officer Dunn is given a proper burial." He paused, collecting himself as though what he's said next required effort. "Your friends too." His brow furrowed. "I have a few favors to call in, but I can make this happen quietly. The last thing I want to do is disturb that place or desecrate it. Those kids need rest." The next morning, they began to go their separate ways. Marla offered to drive Lamar and Jessica to the bus station, and they said their goodbyes with hugs and promises to write. Charlie wondered if any of them meant it. Marla probably did, at least. They pulled out of the Burke's driveway. "So my bus isn't till later," John said as Marla's car disappeared around a bend in the road. "I wouldn't mind a few more hours in Hurricane," Charlie answered. To her surprise, she realized it was true. John flashed her a quick, almost nervous smile. "Okay then," he said. "Let's get out of here. Let's go somewhere. Anywhere." When they were alone in the car, John gave her a sideways glance. "So," he said, Are we ever going to see each other after this?" He tried to say it lightly, but there was no way to lighten it. Charlie stared straight ahead. "Maybe," she said. She could not look at him. It wasn't the answer he wanted. She knew that, but she could not give him what he wanted. What could she say by way of explanation? "It's not you, it's the weight we both bear. It's too much. When you are here, I can't ignore it." But something in her thoughts fell off, not quite right, as if she were speaking by rote, thinking off a script. It was like flinching instinctively to protect an injury before remembering it had healed. She finally looked at John beside her. He was staring through the windshield, his jaw set. I have somewhere to go. I have somewhere I need to go, she said abruptly, then made a slow U-turn. She had never gone to visit the place, but now, without warning, her mind was consumed by it. Aunt Jen had never suggested it. Charlie had never asked. Charlie knew where it was, and now she headed there with a singular sense of purpose. I need to see. Charlie pulled to a stop in a small gravel parking lot beside a low fence of short white posts, chains swinging between them. I just need a minute, she said. John gave her a concerned look. Are you sure you want to do this now? He said softly. She did not answer. Just got out of the car, closing the door behind her. The graveyard before them was almost 100 years old. There were hills of lush green grass and shading trees. This corner was at the edge of the cemetery. There was a small house only a few yards past the edge of the fence. The grass was trimmed neatly, but it was patchy and yellowing. The trees had been pruned too far, so the lower branches were bare too exposed. There was a telephone pole set just inside the fence, barely on the cemetery grounds, and beside it were 2 headstones, plain and small. Charlie stared at it for long enough, not moving. She tried to conjure up the right feeling, grief and loss, so that she could mourn. Instead, she just felt a numbness. The graves were there, but the sight did not touch her. She took a deep breath and started toward them. It was such a small memory, one of those moments that meant nothing at all the time. Just one day in a series of days, the same as all the others. They were together, just the 2 of them, and it must have been before everything, before Fredbear's went wrong, before anyone was dead. They were sitting out back behind Fredbear's, looking out over the hills, and a crow landed and began pecking in the dirt, looking for something. There was something about its sharp, darting movements that struck her as the funniest thing she had seen. Charlie began to laugh, and her father looked at her. She pointed as she turned his head, trying to see as she did, but he could not tell what she was pointing at. She could not get it across to him. She did not know the words, and just as her excitement was about to turn to frustration, he saw it too. Suddenly, he laughed and pointed to the crow. Charlie nodded, and he met her eyes, looking at her with an expression of pure, boundless delight, as if it would fill him to bursting. "Oh, Charlotte," he said. And with that, that's all, folks! We've reached the end! It's over! There we go! We did it! We finished the book! We're done! So, I hope you enjoyed this, month-long read-along of this book. Sorry I finished it late, but yeah, I finished reading a book. That was like the first book I've read in years, because I don't read many books. So that's all I gotta say. I do have the sequels to this book in my bookcase, but I will say that I will be reading the second one either next year or whenever you want, but during the month of October, because it's a spooky story for another time. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. I hope you enjoyed my reading of this book. So, like I said before, that's all, folks. I hope you had a great time, and I'll see you next time. So long, everyone.